explanation for this paradoxical finding. Children's brains are much more plastic than adult brains, and this plasticity helps them keep their options open. Newport provides a different explanation. In addition to having brains that are more plastic, children possess a much more limited cognitive capacity than adults. But wait, shouldn't that be a bad thing? Isn't more cognitive firepower better for learning things? Not necessarily. This is one case where bigger may not be better. Here's how it works. Because adults are capable of encoding and retaining so much more information than children, they learn linguistic structure in a more holistic way. In contrast, because young children have much more limited memory system, they learn linguistic structure in a more compositional way. To illustrate, let's go back to our familiar Gavagai example. Let's suppose that Arunta is a morphologically rich language and that Gavagai is made up of 3 morphemes. Let's say the word as a whole literally means small, furry hopping, where Ga refers to the size of an object, Va refers to the distinctive feature of the object, and Gai refers to the behavior of the object. But I doubt that any language actually uses these morphemes, but they'll work for our purposes. Now, adults may learn the whole word Gavagai as a complete thing without actually realizing that it's composed of 3 individual morphemes. So for all they know, the whole word is a single morpheme referring to a rabbit. This means that for every new word that the adult learns, they map the whole word onto an independent meaning. It's only after some time that they realize that the individual morphemes are contained in the word, which causes them to analyze the parts after they've encoded the whole. This is a convoluted and cumbersome process, and if you've ever tried to learn a foreign language as an adult, it's probably very familiar to you. It's very familiar to me. In contrast, because young children can't encode and remember as much as adults, they initially only remember parts of words. So in our example, they may learn that va means furry in one instance, and the next time they hear the word, they may remember a different part, like guy means hopping, and so on. Over time, this sort of piecemeal learning will actually be more useful to the child to appreciate the morphological complexity of the language. In this way, processing less information allows children to learn more. I think we all have experience with this, even as adults. Think back to a time when you tried to understand some very complex idea and you were overwhelmed by all the moving parts. If you're like most people, it probably helped to break that idea down into smaller pieces and make sure you understood those before you tried to grasp how they all work together. That's basically what young children are forced to do all the time, and it gives them a real advantage in learning the structure of language. I want to say one more thing about Newport's less is more hypothesis, and I want to tie it back to one of our big themes in this course. Given that maturational limitations on memory are very useful in helping young children learn language, it's worth asking what role these constraints played in the large-scale evolution of language. Now, we can quickly rule out that they evolved specifically to help children learn the structure of language. This makes no sense for 2 reasons. First, these cognitive limitations are about as domain general as they get. They affect literally every aspect of a child's mind. Perception, action, attention, emotion, language, you name it. And second, what makes this mechanism so interesting is that these maturational constraints didn't evolve for any purpose at all. These constraints are just a natural byproduct of human brains taking a very long time to develop. That's the unavoidable biology of altricial species. By definition, we have an extended period of cognitive and physical immaturity. There's a term in biology for this phenotypical characteristics that are byproducts of some other aspect of an organism. They're called spandrels. This term was coined by the Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who borrowed it from architecture. In large medieval cathedrals, a spandrel is the triangular space between the exterior curve of an arch and an enclosing right-angled border. These spaces are almost always decorated with art, and if you didn't know any better, you might think that the spandrels were intentionally designed for artistic purposes. They weren't. They were entirely accidental byproducts of supporting arches, and artists co-opted them to serve an aesthetic function. So what's interesting about Newport's less is more hypothesis is that even though cognitive limitations help children learn language, we can be sure that they weren't specifically designed for that purpose. So what's the alternative? Well, what if we flip things around, like Morton Christensen and Nick Chater have asked us to do? Instead of asking, did maturational constraints on learning evolve in response to the structure of language, we might ask, did the structure of language evolve in response to maturational constraints on learning? Recall that Christensen and Chater's argument is that because the basic biology of the human brain changes much more slowly than cultural artifacts like language, the brain is a more likely anchor for evolution than language. After all, humans were an altricial species with an extended period of immaturity for millions of years before language even entered the scene. This suggests that when language did arrive, it had a stable neural environment to adjust to. And a constant feature of that environment is that brains are in a form of extended immaturity while they learn language. So whatever structure language initially took in its evolution should be exquisitely adapted to that particular cognitive environment. This provides one explanation for why languages are organized in a compositional way. It's why they have a hierarchical structure of morphemes that build to words, building to syntax. If young language learners have no choice but to break down communication into bite-sized chunks, that would be an optimal way for language to structure itself. It should take a form that can be most easily digested by young language learners. Does that make sense? Try thinking about it this way. Language evolved to be learnable in the context of the type of brain that was learning it. Here's a useful analogy. The high fat and sugar content in junk food is very stimulating to pleasure centers in the human brain. Why is this? Nobody in their right mind would argue that the invention of junk food was the mechanism that caused brains to like fat and sugar. The preference was already well established in our evolutionary past. Obviously, humans invented junk food because they knew that brains had an almost insatiable love of fat and sugar. Well, it's the same story for language. Language initially fit itself to the constraints of the brain, and not the other way around. Now, you might be thinking, once language and junk food arrived on the scene, haven't they both done a lot to change human brains? Absolutely, and don't worry, we'll get to that story in a later lecture. At this point, I want to pause and take a step back again. It's no longer controversial to claim that there are innate mechanisms for language development. That battle was fought in the mid-20th century, and the behaviorists lost. As you know, the more recent conflict has focused on the nature of these innate mechanisms. Are they specific to language or more domain general? The tide has turned in this clash as well, and now most scientists believe that the domain general theories are the more parsimonious and persuasive explanation. However, this issue is far from resolved, and there are some empirical findings that remain active battlegrounds. I want to share one of those with you right now. Let me set it up with a little context. Before the 1970s, the medical community in the United States was convinced that sign language was not a real language. At the time, researchers and clinicians made assumptions about sign language without really understanding it. Of course, now we know that sign language systems are full-blown and beautiful languages, but things were different back then. There'll be a whole lecture on this topic, so we'll come back to this later. One implication of this view was that the medical community actively discouraged the teaching of sign language to deaf children. In its place, they advocated for lip reading. Unfortunately, this often had damaging consequences for both children and parents because lip reading is extremely hard and not reliable. The story of how the medical community came to see things differently will come later, but now I want to focus on something remarkable that came from this unfortunate situation. It's a true testament to the resilience of language. Despite the practice of not teaching sign to deaf children, many of the children created a language all their own. It was called home sign, and it was systematically documented by Susan Golden Meadow, then at the University of Pennsylvania, as part of her doctoral dissertation. Now, we're not just talking about random hand waving here. Home sign looks a lot like conventional sign language. It's got structure, it's got consistency, and if you didn't know it, you'd be convinced it was actually taught to the children. Not only that, it bears uncanny resemblance among children who develop it. Sure, individual signs differ across children, but the structure is very similar. And this is true not only in the United States. Golden Meadow also observed a similar structure in deaf children from Taiwan. One of the most striking shared structures of home sign is its syntax. Home signers in America and Taiwan both use an ergative syntax. I won't get into the details, but ergativity basically concerns how subjects and verbs are ordered in a sentence. Now here's the interesting thing. Spoken English and Mandarin are not ergative languages. Take a moment to appreciate this. It's really quite remarkable. Where is this common structure coming from? It can't come from the spoken language, because even with lip reading, the syntax of home sign is different from English and Mandarin. Maybe it's the co-speech gestures of the parents. Well, Golden Meadow considered that, and she found that the gestures of American and Taiwanese parents are very different from one another. And it's most likely not coming from the shared social experience of the environment, because America and Taiwan are very culturally different. So if it's not coming from the outside world, the similarities must be coming from within the children. What gives rise to this commonality? Here's where the debate rages. The domain-specific theorists, like Chomsky and Pinker, argue that there is something special, a special module built into the human brain that allows language to unfold in a structured and consistent way, despite not getting conventional input. This is pretty compelling. Seriously, the fact that something so language-like can emerge without any formal instruction makes a domain-specific mechanism sound pretty attractive. It should be no surprise that the domain general theorists interpret home sign, well, more generally. They see it as evidence that the brain is wired in a way that is conducive to learning language, and also a bunch of other things. For example, there may be basic cognitive constraints that guide how meaning is mapped onto imagery and action, or strong social instincts to share and communicate perspectives.